Hello, hello. This is episode number 3 of my private podcast, and we are talking about today setting boundaries for a better life. So, boundaries is definitely a hot topic. We got to wait for Winston to get settled in so he can join the show. But I was just thinking about this. So, this comes out the last Thursday of every month. Clearly, I'm not recording it the last Thursday of the month. I had planned for this to be recorded today, and this is just an example of life is truly a balance of good or bad. And I tell people that all the time. Our goal when we work together is not to make things perfect. It's to make sure that you can handle the good parts, the bad parts, and still move forward in a good way. So I had planned to do this podcast today. I'm going out of town the rest of the week. So I'm trying to cram in 5 days worth of work in 3 days. So yeah, I had this plan this morning and I was up all night because my husband had a stomach bug and he's a loud puker. Hate to throw him out there like that, but it was not enjoyable. So I'm really tired. And one thing I'm thankful for today is concealer to get rid of these baggy eyes. So, and maybe a little bit of Zoom blur and make it look better than what it is. And I'm not big of a makeup person, but today I put some on. So you're welcome. But we're going to get through this. This is part of life. I had this planned. I'm holding a boundary to myself that I still need to do this regardless of how tired I am or how, exhausted I am. So we're going to do this. And I'm really excited to do this one. So if you don't remember, I think I sent it out twice in my email asking for things that you guys wanted to, listen to learn about. I want these private podcasts to be relevant. So that was their time to speak up. And if you haven't and you want to, I'll include the link in the bio or description so you can do that. But boundaries was one thing that I heard multiple times in that survey. And I think it's so important, especially as a young adult or an older adult, whatever stage of life you're in, you need boundaries. And boundaries are a learning experience. It's almost like I heard this analogy yesterday, actually, from another coach. It's almost like a spine. It bends, it curves, it moves with your life. One boundary you need in your young adult lives in your 20s may not be a boundary you need in your 30s or 40s or 2 years down the road. They always change, and that's okay. That's a part of life. Life is always changing, right? All right, so episode number 3, setting healthy boundaries for a better life. So really from childhood, we're often taught to bend or mold ourselves to make others comfortable. And sometimes this message is implied, for example, in a dress code. And sometimes it's direct. So as a child, and I do see this still to this day, I don't care if you don't want to hug your grandfather, it's rude not to. But the one truth is that boundaries are always there. It's all over the place, all stages of our life. And of course, by the time we get to an adult, no wonder some of us find it difficult to hold boundaries because of, those boundaries that were set when we were younger. We don't want to offend or hurt other people's feelings, even when that avoidance ultimately means hurting ourselves. And we're really good at this as humans. We'd rather inflict pain, hurt ourselves in order to not hurt somebody else. We've been taught for such a long time to put our feelings of others ahead of our own needs or put their feelings ahead of our own needs to the point of where many of us don't even know how to answer the question of what are boundaries. So just a quick recap, just basic 101 with what are boundaries? And I have 2 definitions for you. The first one, and both of these came from Google, probably the dictionary of some sort. But the first one is a line that marks the limits of an area or something that indicates a limit. A line that marks the limits of an area or something that indicates a limit. That's definition number 1. Now, definition number 2 is a boundary is a limit or barrier that helps to define a physical, emotional, and mental space between individuals or groups of people. So both of them imply the same thing. They're just worded very differently. And of course, I would assume definition number 2, that's why I included it, is probably a lot more relatable to you because that's how we envision boundaries. Boundaries have to do with us and people around us. And I'm going to be diving more deeper into that with different types of boundaries, internal, and external. So, why are boundaries important for personal growth and well-being? And this is really important to understand because everything that we do when we're trying to grow, when we're trying to reach our goals, when we're trying to learn new things, we really need to understand the why. And the why is what connects us to that goal, to that desire, whatever it might be. And that's where a lot of this motivation, accountability, discipline can come from, as long as you connect yourself to that why. So, 3 things why boundaries are important for us. Number 1, it protects your mental and emotional health. Number 2, it promotes healthy relationships. And number 3, it encourages self-awareness. So when we go back to number 1 with promoting or protecting your mental and emotional health, boundaries allow you to set limits on how much you're willing to give to others and how much you're willing to take from others as well. So this protects you from being overwhelmed or drained by others' needs and allows you to prioritize your own mental and emotional health. Got my coffee here, you know it. Next one is promoting healthy relationships. So boundaries allow you to communicate your needs and expectations clearly to others and to respect the needs and expectations of others in return. So this really promotes healthy, respectful, mutually beneficial relationships that include avoiding misunderstandings or conflicts. And that's something that's really important. I'm going to go off on a tangent here for a second because boundaries are essential to relationships, family relationships, personal relationships, maybe a partner, boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, wife, friendships, working relationships. They all have boundaries, and the boundaries are really there to help grow a healthy relationship and avoid misunderstandings, conflicts. That's the whole reason we set boundaries and we communicate, is essentially to avoid conflicts and misunderstandings, to understand that we're on the same page, or at least the other person is aware of the page that they're on or you're on, but they aren't necessarily on. So the last thing is encouraging self-awareness. Boundaries really enforce you to reflect on your values, your beliefs, your priorities, and make intentional choices about how you want to live your life, which is super important. Boundaries require you to take a look at your life, understand your values, who you are as a person, what do you like, what do you not like, and then choose to move forward in the way that best serves you. By setting and respecting your own boundaries, you can develop a greater sense of self-awareness and personal responsibility, which can more effectively pursue your goals, or which you can more effectively pursue your goals and aspirations. So I think all of those are really important. I'd say my top 2 are promoting that healthy relationships, encouraging that self-awareness, because it requires you, and that kind of goes hand in hand. They're all important because protecting your mental and emotional health, you have to have self-awareness in order to do that. All of these are super important, but boundaries require you to grow internally. It requires you to understand your values, release your priorities, which come into play for all parts of your life. So what I mean by this is that boundaries affect all parts of your life. And that includes your time, your health, your mindset, your money, your relationships, your career. So all 3 of those reasons that I was talking about before can come into play with each parts of your life, right? Your time, your health, your mindset, your money, your relationships, your career. And in order to set healthy boundaries, to live a better life or to have a better life, you need to understand boundaries in general, kind of like Boundaries 101, like an entry-level course. So when I think about boundaries, I divide them in two sections. And this is going to be our biggest talking point that's going to encompass everything that we've discussed so far. In these two sections that I divide boundaries into are internal boundaries and external boundaries. All right. So we're going to be focused on internal boundaries and external boundaries. And I want to use the analogy of a house. Just to illustrate the concept of these boundaries. So the walls represent external boundaries that maybe keep unwanted influences out, while the interior design represents your internal boundaries that reflect personal values and needs. So two things that you need in order to have boundaries: number one, awareness. So going back to what I said with self-awareness. Number two, communication. Communication with yourself internally, but also external communication with others. And with these two skills, your boundaries are going to help you grow your identity. So let's go ahead and dive into the two different types of boundaries, starting with external. So when it comes to external boundaries, we have a definition here. So this definition says, boundaries we set to protect ourselves from other people, places, or things. So anything outside of you, that is external boundaries. And going back to the different parts of life that boundaries affect, this affects, when it comes to external boundaries, it affects your time boundaries, your social boundaries, your financial boundaries, your physical boundaries, and something that I saw that I really, really like as well, because this is a hot topic now, is your technology boundaries. And I want to talk about each one of these. So when it comes to time boundaries, this includes setting specific times for work that involves your career, socializing, personal activities. So for example, setting a specific time to leave work or scheduling time for self-care activities. I see it a lot with young adults is, this is a really big boundary that you're still learning to navigate in your 20s, is how to set boundaries at work, where they say, yeah, you're going to work today from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. Next thing you know, it's 6:30 and you're still there and you don't know how to tell your boss that you need to leave, right? The next one, for social boundaries, this really includes setting limits on the amount of time we spend with certain people, as well as defining what it is and what's not acceptable in social situations. And this is a really important one, because this goes back to what I talked about at the beginning about being guilty. We'd rather harm ourselves than harm other people, and not physically, but just by setting boundaries, we're scared to do that. We'd rather people please than actually put ourselves first. And I see this a lot with social boundaries, especially with friendships, because in your 20s, I feel like there's a really strong connection with friends because, there's college, you're in your younger adulthood. So it's easier to go out with friends. It's easier to make connections like that. So, people tend to do that a lot, but they spend too much time with certain people, or people maybe that aren't beneficial to them. They're not helping them move forward. So that's important to understand. And also, that kind of goes into play what's not acceptable behavior in social situations. So for me, I have gone through my 20s, and that's why I help you. But for me, a boundary that I have now in my 30s is it's just not acceptable to me to just get piss-ass drunk on a Saturday night. It's not beneficial to me anymore. And nor is it acceptable for me to be around maybe my friends that are like that as well. That's just a no-no. I still enjoy alcohol. I still go out with my friends, but I'm just not going to do it in a bar setting, like a club setting. That's a perfect example. I ain't about that life anymore. And that's a boundary that I have, a social boundary for myself. So let's just say, for example, if a friend, which I don't have friends like this, but if a friend was to say, hey, let's go out clubbing and go out in the town, I can confidently say no, thank you, because I know that is an external boundary that I'm not willing to cross. So the next one is financial boundaries. So this includes creating budgets, sticking to it, deciding plans for the future. And all of this happens in your 20s and continues to progress in your 30s, 40s, 50s. It just changes. Your boundaries change, like I said, as the years progress. So really, a financial boundary that has to be set in your 20s is having a budget and really sticking to it. And knowing this kind of goes into play with your social boundaries, knowing that if you don't have social boundaries, your financial boundaries are also going to be a burden. They're also going to be in trouble because social boundaries also include spending money, going out with friends and doing things. Not all the time, but most of the time, it does require some sort of financial investment. So that's what that's what I'm talking about when it comes to financial boundaries as a young adult, which are externally is creating a budget, but then sticking to it, which also comes into play with internal boundaries. Of course, we're going to talk about at a later point. With physical boundaries, this includes setting limits on physical touch or personal space with others, as well avoiding certain physical situations that may be uncomfortable or harmful. This includes respecting your body. I'm going to just kind of say it with how it says limits on physical touch, personal space. What do you like? What do you not like? Is it okay for someone to come up and just grab your arm? Is it okay? Do you like hugs? At this point, once again, going back to what I talked about, how we're kind of forced as a child to hug people, whether we want to or not. This is where you can set a boundary as a young adult. You don't have to hug if you're not a people person or a touchy person. You are not required to do that. This also comes into play with personal relationships, boyfriends, girlfriends, wives, husbands, that sort of thing. You need to understand what physical situations, boundaries are okay, not okay to you, but also, making sure that you don't put yourself in that harm's way. So not necessarily in relationships, but like going back to that example of a club that I was talking about, social boundaries with drinking and just having those behaviors around me. In that circumstance, I may be more likely to get hit on. Let's just say that. And someone may try to come up and hold my hand. I'm just using it as an example. That's not okay to me. And you have to understand that what's okay, what's not okay. And then also, the next step, which could be a whole different podcast, is how to enforce boundaries, how to communicate boundaries then at that point. But right now, we're just talking about the awareness piece, what boundaries are okay to you, not okay to you, so on and so forth. So the next one is technology boundaries. And this one I really like. It's very different. I didn't actually think about this one when I was preparing for this podcast, but I like it. This includes setting limits on time spent on social media or electronic devices, and as well as setting specific times for checking emails and messages. I think that's super important because our tendency naturally is to just stay on our phone or to stay on the TV or to play video games. And really, that can only get us so far. That is definitely something, a hobby or activity we can do in our spare time, but that shouldn't take up hours worth of our time. And I'm not perfect. I will say that right now. I have my vices as well, but being more aware of that and what's okay and not okay to you. For some people, it may be no more than an hour on social media, but for others, it may be no more than 4 hours. That's up for you to decide. But there needs to be a boundary when it comes to technology, because in the long run, it does hold you back from what you want. So going back to the whole communication piece of why is it important to communicate boundaries? And of course, I've already said this before. Hopefully you can guess what I'm going to say. It helps reduce conflict, especially with those external boundaries. And external boundaries can reduce conflict basically by setting those clear expectations on limits and behaviors, communication and interaction with others. So when external boundaries are established and communicated effectively, they can help prevent misunderstandings, conflicts before they arise. So for example, as a young adult, if your roommate is, if you're with your roommate, let's just say you have one, and they need quiet time to study from 7 to 9 p.m. and communicate that clearly, you're less likely to be unintentionally disruptive and just basically cause conflicts. Maybe a very simple boundary, but that's how these all start. We need to start with very small boundaries like this in order for us to build up to those really big value, belief, the non-negotiable boundaries that you have. So similarly, if you set a boundary with your boss that you cannot work on weekends due to other commitments and you communicate that clearly, you're less likely to be scheduled for weekend shifts and experience any conflicts like that. Of course, we know in the workplace and of course the personal place, let's be honest, that may still happen. And that's okay. You have to understand as well, just because you set a boundary doesn't mean that people are going to retain that information. Your job is to continuously set that boundary for yourself if needed. It is not the other person's job to remember every single person's boundary. So overall, external boundaries really help as a young adult to build your personal values, your priorities, your goals, also while respecting boundaries of other people. And once again, I just think it's the biggest thing because we are people pleasers. We do things to reduce conflict. This is reducing conflict in a better way than putting yourself in harm's way. So next, we are going to dive into internal boundaries, which this is a perfect segue. So when it comes to internal boundaries, of course, we're going to start with a definition, just like we did with just regular boundaries and external boundaries. So internal boundaries, this is a lot longer of a definition. Internal boundaries refer to the personal limits and guidelines that individuals set for themselves regarding their thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. These boundaries can involve self-discipline, self-respect, and self-awareness. They reflect an individual's ability to regulate their own actions and responses and be accountable for their choices and decisions. I love that definition because internal boundaries also require you to take accountability for your own actions. You are responsible for your actions. You're the one that can say yes or no, hold up a boundary, not hold up a boundary, that sort of thing. And these boundaries even come down to your emotions, your thoughts, which is a deeper conversation as well. And I like, when I read that definition immediately, it went to the thought of arguments. So we've all been in an argument where we've raised our voice, someone else has raised their voice, and that's a boundary. You have to set a boundary for yourself with your emotions and the way you communicate to people, and if that's okay to you. If that's okay for you to yell at people, that may be a boundary you have to reassess. Gonna be honest there, all right? Some tough love. But we need to understand that if that's important for us to speak as an adult to another person and not to yell at them, then you need to enforce that boundary with yourself. And if you cross that line, you cross that boundary, then you need to have accountability and responsibility for doing that. All right. So anyways, I have a couple examples, and some of them are very similar to the external boundaries. And I will say, I've divided it between external and internal boundaries. External is everything outside of you. We're getting into the internal now. My dog's dreaming. It's so funny. He dreams all the time when I'm on coaching calls, things like this. It must be like my voice is soothing to him. How hilarious. All right. Anyways, just don't mind him. He'll probably wake up in a couple minutes. So I was talking about internal and external boundaries. So we're going to be talking about very similar things because there is a gray line between both of these. It's not just a clear black and white external, internal boundaries. So when it comes to internal boundaries, we're going to be talking about emotional boundaries, time boundaries, which is kind of that gray area similar to what we talked about with the external boundaries with time. Value boundaries, social boundaries, there's another similar one, and then physical boundaries is another one as well. All right. So when it comes to emotional boundaries, this involves recognizing your own emotional or your own emotions, and of course, limiting how much you let them affect your decisions, your relationships with others. And it also means learning to communicate your emotions effectively. That's a whole nother, once again, conversation in itself. So, this kind of goes into the self-development, self-growth piece, is that a lot of us don't know really how to identify our feelings or emotions. So in order for you to create emotional boundaries, you need to build self-awareness around those emotions. One piece of a material that I use, it's free, I'm not going to gatekeep it, that I help my clients with, and I also use actually with my stepson. We have this posted on a refrigerator that will help him, but it's called the Wheel of Emotions. Go ahead and Google it. You can find it everywhere. It is a very well-known piece of material that coaches use, even therapists, a lot of people use it. But what it does is it helps you identify your emotions on a deeper level than the standard good, mad, bad, sad, that sort of thing. And that's really important to help identify your emotions greater than just good or fine or something like that, because our emotions are deeper than that. You just may not be aware to the different types of emotions that you could be having. And just because you don't know them, that means you're just going to identify as good or bad. All right. So next one is time boundaries. And for this really involves setting limits on how much time you spend on different activities, prioritizing what's important to you. And this is important because, of course, it can help with burnout and making sure you're using your time effectively, but really making sure that you're keeping yourself on track. And I will say sometimes boundaries aren't fun. Like, it's like, oh, I don't want to set that boundary with myself, but it's necessary. And, boundaries come with self-discipline, awareness, communication, understanding. There are all these other underlying skills. So I think this is important with time boundaries, is involving setting limits on how much time you spend on different activities. So for example, going back to the technology boundaries with external stuff, setting a boundary with social media, it is important. We do need to do that. So really understanding that and then holding yourself accountable to that. Because it's not going to help you move forward in your life. All right. Or it could be as simple as just understanding that, hey, I kind of want to start reading more. So making sure that you're efficiently using your time. Let's say you're putting a time boundary on bedtime at 8:30. So you go to bed at 8:30, and that means you get to read for 30 minutes before you actually turn the lights off. There's a time boundary, a positive time boundary that you can enforce. And I will say that brings me to another short tangent, I'm going to say. When we say boundaries, sometimes it means negative boundaries, but boundaries are also positive as well. Typically, people associate boundaries in a negative situation, like I need to enforce a boundary here, or this is not acceptable. There needs to be a boundary. And that doesn't happen all the time. Boundaries are positive, and it can be in this simple way of like, all right, bedtime's at 8 for me because I want to start reading, and that's something I used to love to do. I just haven't been using my time efficiently, and I'm going to start doing that today. That's positive. All right, next one is value boundaries. And this involves being really clear on your personal boundaries, your beliefs, and really making choices that align with them. And this is where the self-awareness piece once again comes into play, just with everything else. But really understanding what's most important to you. And I think that's super important to answer that question, or just to think about it, what's most important to you. But when it comes to values, some people, you may be like, well, I don't know what values are. Like, how do I know what my values are? And here's another simple thing that you can Google is a list of values. Here we go. It's going to be a rough day for me. Google list of values. And I know Brene Brown has a really good piece on this, but you can find it everywhere where there's going to be like a PDF of like 50 boundaries. They're not boundaries, values. And just look at them. Review them. Maybe if you want to take it a step further, print it out and circle the ones that really call to you. So one of my boundaries is growth. It is very important. One of my boundaries, one of my values is growth. And that's really important to me. I value growth. I value continuously learning and developing myself. So now I do things that are aligned with that value. And that's enforced by a boundary. All right. So next one is social boundaries. So setting those limits, those interactions with others based on how much time you spend with them, what activities you participate in, what personal information you share as well, which I love that one. Social boundaries can include how much personal information you share with others. And I think this is my assumption and definitely from my experience, and I know you guys can relate to this, we talk about a lot when we're younger, but as we get older, people don't need to know all of your business. They don't need to know, like, for example, you're not going to tell a random acquaintance friend how much money you make a year. That's an example. I know it's a little bit extreme, but that's an example of how you can have a social boundary with what personal information you share. It's also good to be understanding and aware of how friendships work and what type of friendships you have. If you have a group of friends and there's one that's a very big gossiper, I may limit that information that I share with her because I don't want that person to take that information and warp it, run with it, tell everybody, because that's not what I'd like. I don't want my personal information to be shared like that. So that's really something to understand as well with social boundaries, is understanding your relationships with different people and what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, that sort of thing. Something that's really important as well that I see in couples that I respect is not sharing relationship information. Not going to your group of friends and just completely trash talk your boyfriend, husband, wife, girlfriend, whatever it might be, your partner. Not going to trash talk them. You make the decision to work through that with your partner without sharing that personal information with your friends. That's a really big boundary. Social boundary, especially when you're starting to get older and more wiser and understand, you have that self-awareness and understand how those boundaries work. Lastly, for internal boundaries, this is physical boundaries. So basically what I talked about with external boundaries as well is, setting limits on physical interactions could be such as touching, hugging, invading personal space. And it also means respecting other people's boundaries in return. I think that's really important. You have to hold a boundary to yourself and understand that other people have boundaries that you may not agree with or you may not like, but you still have to hold yourself to that. So with internal boundaries, it's really important for maintaining emotional, mental well-being, and of course, really establishing a sense of self-respect and self-trust with yourself. All right. So really, when it comes to, I kind of want to talk about common challenges that you as a young adult may face when setting boundaries. And we have fear of rejection, guilt or shame, lack of self-awareness, people-pleasing tendencies, low self-esteem or self-worth, and fear of conflict. Now, I don't know, as you're listening to this, when I read this, I was like, have a little bit of each of those, which is pretty common because we want to naturally people please. We don't want conflict. Us as humans naturally want to avoid that. So of course, all of these have a little piece of that. So with fear of rejection or abandonment, setting boundaries could potentially mean to you saying no to people or situations that are not healthy or beneficial, which can trigger fear of losing connection or being rejected. Guilt or shame can be really, for many young adults, have been conditioned to put others' needs before their own. And of course, leading to feelings of guilt or shame when they prioritize their own needs. Lack of self-awareness, which hopefully, if this is a common challenge that you've had, hopefully this podcast has really helps you build that self-awareness, just talking through these things. But that can be challenging to set internal boundaries if you do not know your own values, beliefs, your limits. And as a young adult, you do need to do work on this, really to identify those internal boundaries, because this is a point where you're on your own, you are growing up, you're becoming an adult, and these are the things you need to understand with yourself. Number 4, people-pleasing tendencies. So you may struggle with people-pleasing tendencies, which of course can make it difficult to say no, which kind of goes back to the number 1 with fear of rejection or abandonment. Low self-esteem or self-worth. So this can make it challenging if to assert yourself or set a boundary if you don't feel worthy, like if you don't feel valid of having needs, or may fear being seen as selfish. And then last one is conflict, fear of conflict. So setting boundaries, which kind of goes into the rejection, the people-pleasing tendencies. We're creatures of habit. Like, we don't want to start conflict. We want to avoid. Seek pleasure, avoid pain. That's essentially part of the fear of conflict. And so it's challenging, especially if you've never set boundaries, to actually assert or set a boundary, maybe with yourself or somebody else, because you have that fear of conflict, and it may be difficult to manage that. So I think it's important to understand, no one sets boundaries for you. You have to learn to do that for yourself. And boundaries help you create the life that is aligned, or create the life that's aligned with your values, supports your growth and well-being, and fosters healthy, fulfilling relationships with others. So I want you to reflect on your own internal boundaries, starting with just internal. Can help you identify at a later point what external boundaries need to be set in place. All right. So when deciding what boundaries you set, figure out what you can or can't do. And remember to focus on those different parts. So the time, the health, the mindset, the money, the relationships. All right. So with internal boundaries, I just want you to brainstorm. Okay, just because you brainstorm doesn't mean it has to be valid. It's true. This is just a thought generating process to get your creative juices flowing, and kind of explore what potential internal boundaries that you have. All right. So what are they? What are some things you're not proud of yourself for? What parts of your life do you need to improve? What can you do, and what can you not do? All right, so answer those questions for yourself to identify internal boundaries. What are they? What are some things you're not proud of yourself for? What parts of your life do you need to improve? What can you do? What can you not do? And of course, I've kind of already said this, boundaries are a work in progress that really build on life experiences. And it might be slightly I don't want to say controversial, but it is a truth, kind of a harsh reality. This does include the bad things. You're going to go through bad experiences in life, and that's how you understand certain boundaries. Going back to what I said at the beginning with my morning or my nighttime, lack of sleep and all that, life is a balance of good and bad. You are always going to have bad things happen in your life. You have to learn how to handle them by experiencing them and then learning how to set boundaries. All right. How are you supposed to know your boundaries if they don't get crossed? There's food for that. So we've talked about boundaries. We've talked about internal boundaries. We've talked about external boundaries, and we've kind of divided them into those different parts of your life with time, money, health, your mindset, your relationships, your careers. Next thing I want you to do is to start exploring your internal boundaries. Explore those questions that I said. That's going to help you identify your external boundaries, or maybe just start creating a journal, or have a page just for internal and have a page just for external, and start writing things down when you experience them. So you can see a list building of boundaries that you have, the positives and the negative boundaries. So thank you for listening to this. I hope this was super helpful for you, so you're able to set boundaries in order to live a better life. Talk to you guys soon.